I'm Dr. Nancy Siegel from California State University, Fullerton. When Tony Vernon asked me to introduce Tom Bouchard, I was very excited because Tom and I have been friends and colleagues for so many years. But I was also very nervous because I was told that I only had 2 or 3 minutes to do this, and that's hardly enough time to describe all the wonderful things that Tom has done in his career. But then I realized that I could sum it up in just one sentence. And that is that I can say unequivocally that Tom's work, the landmark Minnesota study of twins raised apart, forever changed the way that we study human behavior and think about it. By studying 137 pairs of separated twins, 81 identical and 51 fraternal, Tom showed that genetics affects virtually every measured human trait, from intelligence to personality, to social attitudes, to job satisfaction. And Tom also conducted an elegant 4-group design, identical and fraternal twins, raised apart and together, to show that personality similarity is not governed by shared environments, but it is governed by shared genes. And these findings and others like it were stunning, and they were controversial, coming as they did in the 1980s when so many people embraced environmental explanations of behavior. And anyone who dared to do behavioral genetic research took a huge academic risk. But the findings have withstood the test of time, and after all, replication is what our field is all about. I also have to say that there's a certain symmetry in that almost 20 years ago to the day, Tom was the recipient of the Galton Award and gave a major address in London, England. And so today he's giving a major address here in London, Ontario. And it would be just too corny to say it's twin talks delivered apart. So you didn't hear me say that. But you are hearing me say that it's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Thomas Bouchard.
First things first. When I got here, I saw this logo and I fell in love with it. I think it's absolutely gorgeous, and I just heard that one of Tony Vernon's students did it, and I think she should get an applause. That's really gorgeous. Okay, I also like to thank Tony and ISID for inviting me. The invitation came quite a while back, and it really provided an opportunity for me to start thinking about some things that I had hoped I would write about and think about. And I put it together specifically for this talk. And this talk is based on a paper that is currently under review at PAID. I hope one of the reviewers at least is here and appreciates it. The title, actually, I'm not going to talk about twins per se, but the database is all the participants who were in the Minnesota study of twins reared apart. And that was a big project, took a long time, and I want to thank the hundreds of participants and numerous colleagues. Over 20 years, I think there were about 45 faculty members at the University of Minnesota that helped us out. Almost that many students, graduate, undergraduate students, so it's an enormous list, but I want to especially thank Nancy Siegel, Margaret Keyes, and Wendy Johnson, who really shepherded that project through for years and years and years. And there's no way I could have done the work myself. Those kinds of people helped me dramatically. Now, if you have any questions about the study, I recommend you look at this book. This is the most comprehensive survey of everything we did over 20 years. It's a very, very complete picture of the study. I'd like to do a little bit of early history with regard to experience-producing drive theory. The second paper I published was actually a book chapter, and it was a chapter on theories of intelligence. And at that time, I started reading the literature. I knew some stuff as a graduate student, but I started reading the literature, and I ran into a very, very interesting paper. It was by Quinn McNamara. How many people in here know who Quinn McNamara is? I got about 5 or 6 hands.
I know the McNamara test.
What's that?
I know the McNamara test.
Well, he did the McNamara test. He wrote the statistics textbook I learned all my statistics from. He was a professor at Stanford, and he was the president of APA. This is his presidential address, and this is a paper still worth reading 50 years later. But in any event, he said, by far the most provocative recent discussion I've encountered is the closely reasoned 44-page paper by Keith Hayes. He put forth a motivational experiential theory of intelligence. In essence, he presumed there are hereditary differences in motivation, experience-producing drives, and environmental differences produce differences in experience, which in turn, by way of learning, lead to differences in ability. I agree with McNamara. This is a very provocative paper, really, in my opinion, a brilliant paper. It was published in a less than stellar journal. I don't think too many people read psych reports, but this is the paper. And what Hayes tried to do is this review attempts to integrate the developments which have occurred recently, largely independently, in 3 areas of psychology: behavior genetics, motivation, and theory of intelligence. Now, this paper was published in 1962. Most of you probably weren't even born then. But 1962, you did not talk about genetics and behavior. It was literally a taboo subject. But 1962 was a good year for behavior genetics, because there was another paper published in the American Psychologist, another presidential address, and it was by my colleague Paul Meehl. And in that paper, he asserted that schizophrenia was a genetic disorder. What's very interesting about both papers is they're very, very explicit that learning and genetics are not processes that are opposed to each other. Genetics, in terms of its effects on the psyche or whatever, causes certain kinds of learning. And I use causes not in parentheses, but causes as a causal mechanism. That's the reason we do behavior genetics, to get at fundamental causal mechanisms. Okay, back to Keith Hayes. Actually, Keith Hayes and his wife were the first people to actually raise a chimpanzee in their home and try to teach the animal language. And these are the 2 classic papers. You can see they were written quite a few years ago. Still very, very interesting. I think it's unbelievably courageous to bring a chimpanzee into your house and try to raise it. The few psychologists who've done that really deserve special awards of some sort. Here's a picture of Keith Hayes with Vicky. Well, in any event, in 1968, I used Hayes' theory in my paper on intelligence, and then I almost forgot it. And this whole story here is a nice lesson in how long it takes for an idea to penetrate Bouchard's brain. Okay? But I've written a number of papers over the years where I try to elaborate experience-producing drive theory and generalize it to individual differences. Hayes was primarily interested in intelligence, spoke about very little else. I tried to extend it. This was a Feshra for Julian Stanley at the time, and I was free to write about anything I wanted, so I kind of elaborated. But I've extended it in a number of places. Here's another paper, relatively obscure, however, even hard to get on the web, unfortunately. And more recently, I've expanded it in the context of intelligence again. So I've written a few papers. My friend and colleague, Wendy Johnson, has actually helped me along with this particular theory, and she's used it in a couple of places. So here's an example. Now, it's not entirely unique to me. Sandra Scar has proposed a very, very similar theory. And these are her two classic papers on the topic. Now, Sandra is a good friend of mine, although she's been retired for a while and I haven't seen her. But in 1983, she published this paper, and she was across the road in the Institute of Child Development, and I went over to see her, and I said, Sandra, you know, I've written about this, and so is somebody else, this guy by the name of Keith Hayes. And she went, holy cows, I read that paper and completely forgot it. But her paper is based on Keith Hayes' initial paper. She just completely forgot it. And in the 96 paper, she cites me in the background of that particular paper. So Hayes has had some influence, but it took quite a few years. Writing in 1962, we didn't get to it till later. Now, one of the founders of the society, Hans Isaac, and his colleagues expressed the idea underlying EPD theory very astutely a number of years ago. It sees humans as exploring organisms whose innate abilities and predispositions help them select what's relevant and adaptive from the range of opportunities and stimuli presented by the environment. The effects of mobility and learning therefore augment rather than eradicate the effects of the genotype on behavior. Again, I repeat this all the time, because people who attack behavior genetics are always somehow or other implying that learning or being exposed to the environment is somehow irrelevant. Every major statement by behavior geneticists who are developing theory make it clear that genes, genetic influences, depend on the environment. So they're not in opposition. It's just a terrible mistake to go on with that. Well, if things are genetic, the question is, how did they come about? And if there's considerable variability in these underlying predispositions, mental abilities, whatever you want to call them, they must have evolved. And so there's a real evolutionary question. Now, my own view of personality has always been pretty critical of the way we ordinarily measure. I'm not a fan of the big five, as you're going to find out very soon. There's just never been quite what I thought personality variables should be. And so I think what we've been measuring up to now has not been up to the task. And I think you can get a better picture of what we ought to be doing if you bring an evolutionary perspective to bear on these issues. And I want to mention Nancy Siegel again, because when I started the study of twins right apart, I knew very little about evolution or evolutionary psychology. And she badgered me, and I was resistant. But finally I gave in, and thank you very much, Nancy, because I've spent a lot of my career on this since. Again, sometimes it's just hard to get into Bouchard's head. One of the best statements, I think, about how evolution and personality come together was actually specified, whoops, sorry, did I do that correctly? By Vince Serich. Anybody know who Vince Serich is in this room? Nancy Siegel does. Anybody else? That's absolutely amazing. Vince Serich is an anthropologist at Berkeley. He invented the molecular clock, which is used every day in evolutionary theory to date organisms that you can collect DNA from. He's not a minor figure. Very controversial guy, though. There later in his career, he talked about race differences, etc. And he got the name the Bull of Berkeley. Very, very interesting man. His stuff is fascinating to read. But he pointed out, this is a letter to the editors, and it's a response to an article by the science writer John Horgan, who wrote an anti-behavior genetic diatribe in the American Psychologist. I mean, it was awful. In fact, it's a long letter, and Sarich ends his letter saying, I just finished grading the students in my anthropology course, and you get an F for shame. I mean, it was a horrible, horrible article. In any event, he points out, we've been interactively social for at least 10 million years. So he's talking about primates, not human beings. And interactive sociality only works to the extent that individuals within the social group practice voluntary reciprocal exchange. But that's going to work only to the extent that they have something to exchange, which means the other individuals in any social relationship is going to have to do, and do is capitalized and my capitalization, something for you better than you can do for yourself. Otherwise, the exchange, and therefore the social relationship, would have no reason for being, and interactive sociality could never have evolved. Clearly, this selects for variation, ensuring strong individuality. So what we have here is the case for this society and what we do. But again, I'm going to argue we haven't been measuring it quite rightly. But the focus on doing is the issue. There's no question about it. Now, this particular topic, by the way, is a hot one in evolutionary theory. A recent paper in Nature on exactly this, the evolution of stable sociality. These authors argue sociality based on loose aggregation, they're looking at its evolution over long periods of time, is followed by a second shift to stable or bonded groups. This structuring facilitates the evolution of cooperative behavior or behaviors, and may provide the scaffolding for other distinctive anthropoid traits, including coalition formation, cooperative resource defense, and large brains. I've used the argument in the context of large brains in the context of the evolution of intelligence, because across virtually all species, the larger the brain, the brighter the organism. Even though Stephen Jay Gould argued about that for years and years and years, he's flatly wrong. The evidence is absolutely overwhelming. Okay, let's move to higher primates, human beings. A recent paper by Brent Roberts, who's I'm sure well known to the audience, and colleagues, including my colleague Bob Kruger, wrote an interesting paper. Because I'm going to take conscientiousness apart, and a bunch of other big fives as well. Some serious thinking is due on the front of reconciling traits and motives. Finally, an even broader and more inclusive perspective on motivation would include constructs like interests and values, things people desire. Further research that attempts to bring clarity to this confusing array of constructs would need to also include additional constructs. Well, this is exactly what I'm going to try to deal with. But let me point out, I'm not the only person who's ever tried to deal with it, so there are others. The most complicated one and nicest one, in my opinion, is Phil Ackerman's work on trait complexes. I don't get quite the same results, but this is really some very, very nice work. And of course, Richard Snow struggled with this issue for years in the domain of education. So there are other people, but I think these are the two dominant models that one might want to look at. Okay, EPD theory then asserts that personality is best reflected in the psychological niches that active organisms select and create for themselves when faced with the complex ecologies of which they must make sense of over the course of development. I always like the old phrase from William James about organisms coming into the buzzing, confusing world and having to make sense of it. Anybody who has an evolutionary sense knows that they don't make sense of it in some random way. They're prepared by evolution to deal with large classes of things. In fact, the best people who work with this particular topic are Tooby and Cosmides in evolutionary psychology. They've got wonderful papers on this topic. Now, they tend to focus on human beings as all being very, very similar. And I don't think they have a good model of why we have the differences we have. But they're good friends of mine, so I fight with them all the time. I recently visited with them and talked about this. So the topic is in the air, but what I want to say is, while Sarich has a nice model, etc., we really don't have types. So the question is, and we are very, very similar genetically. So the question is, how do we end up in these different niches? What are the biological mechanisms that cause this? I don't have the vaguest idea, and I don't think anybody else does. So there's a major research issue here. In any event, what I want to emphasize here is the emphasis is on driving motivational forces that control transactions with the environment, both social, physical, as well as internal states. We transact with our own internal states. We sit there and puzzle about things. We do hypotheticals. Some of us, my wife is always saying, what the hell's going on? You haven't said a word in the last 10 minutes because I'm trying to solve some problem. I'm transacting with myself, but then I go and I transact with the textbooks, and then I go and transact with my computer. But I'm doing things. And I want to emphasize, evolution has created organisms who do things. They don't sit there and wait for stimuli to hit them. They work with the environment constantly. That's dramatically true with the vast majority of lower animals, but it's also true of us. And so this focus on doing, as Sarich has pointed out, I think is fundamental. Okay. So this view requires that the measurement of personality include the assessment of individuals' choices, so physical, psychological, and social environments. Consequently, the choice of activities, occupations, and types of people one prefers to associate with, vocational interest items, as well as values and social attitudes, are parts of one's personality. From this point of view, there is no difference between personality, values, social attitudes. It's a silly distinction if you specialize in one and don't talk to the other. But of course, we have journals that do just that, except for paid. Paid, you can pick up an issue of paid, and you can read about any of these things, which is really the great contribution of Hans Ising to individual differences. He talked about individual differences. On the other hand, most major universities, certainly in the United States, don't even teach individual differences. They teach personality in the narrowest possible sense. Huge, huge mistake. Okay. The question is how to proceed. Well, let me first take a little sidestep here and discuss some work from one of my colleagues, Alka Teligan. I think Alka Teligan is one of the great personality researchers, theorists in the world. But I'm biased. I was a colleague for many, many years, and we sat down and talked a lot. But Teligan worked on an instrument called the Multidimensional Personality Questionnaire for many years. And he used a procedure no one else has ever used, with the slight exception, I was talking with Greg Boyle about this the other day, Raymond Patel used something somewhat similar. Tellegen called it the exploratory scale construction technique. And what he did was he looked at major theories and major constructs, and he said, how can we best measure this? And he used factor analysis, but he also used his head. And he did repetitive studies, constantly refining and working with the construct and with the data, until he got what he felt was really strong validity and convergent validity and discriminant validity. But every construct went through multiple cycles. Very few instruments in psychology even come close. And unfortunately, after I think 17 or 18 years, he said, well, I'm going to stop now, but I haven't covered all the ground. He's very explicit about not having covered. He did the method, he got a very, very useful test. And so the question becomes, did he succeed? Well, in point of fact, he did. He succeeded masterfully. One of his students, Nils Waller and I, and Colin DeYoung, carried out a massive analysis of 1,102 items from the MMPI, the CPI, and the NPQ. And I drove this study, so I'm the lab chief, so I'm last off. The question is, if Tellegen scales are so good, do they survive when mixed with all these other items? We got 300 items from the MPQ, but we got a total of 1,100 items. What we did, we took out all the semantic twins so that we weren't getting these phony clusters. Well, what do you think happened? 9 of the original scales came out almost perfectly. We never had more than one item from an MPQ scale that turned up on another scale. And they were coherent as they were made when he made them. They had unusual structural robustness. I don't believe any other personality test in existence could pass this test. This is a risky test. Think about it. Put your test to the test and see what happens. Now, it wasn't perfect. The aggression scale actually bifurcated into a physical and relational aggression, a distinction that's looked at regularly in developmental psychology, and it's a distinction between males and females. So he kind of missed that, but he did get aggression. And a new scale called civility captured most of traditionalism. So for all practical purposes, we really recovered all the MPQ scales. So we have a really fundamental set of scales to work with. Just as a brief aside, I've actually been able to do a quasi-replication. As part of our twin study, David Licken wrote a 63-item self-report instrument with items like this. And he had a number of them that were designed to reflect the MPQ scales. But he had 16 additional items that were his pet kinds of ideas. And guess what? We got all 11 MPQ scales out of a factor analysis of that data. So we recovered them using a different method. Not only that, this was based on about 4,000 twins. So we were able to divide the sample into males and females, and we replicated across both genders. The previous study, we adjusted for sex statistically. And by the way, that analysis was done on tetrachoric correlations for the items, not your standard looser approaches. So my argument is we have really a fundamental set of scales to look at the kinds of issues I'm interested in. These are the scales. We call it the Minnesota Personality Inventory. And the 9 in bold are the original MPQ scales. They've all been supplemented by a few items, so the average scale length is 29. There's a nice scale length. Reasonable alphas. Aggression is divided into 2. Civility. Unlikely virtues was also a validity scale in the MPQ, and it came through just like the other scales. And it has psychological meaning, so we continue to use it. Other scales are all quite meaningful. Intellectual interest has been known as a scale in the MMPI for a long time. Costa got it. Phil Ackerman has a scale called typical intellectual interest, the TIE scale. The overlapping content of the items is very, very similar. There's a religiousness scale that works very well. I've published 2-3 papers on it. The other scales, shyness, fear, unworthiness, and cynicism, were missed by Tellegen as far as we can tell, but they haven't been through the exploratory scale construction technique yet, so they would have to be tried out. General health has been a scale in the MMPI for a long time, and Nils Waller has done a lot of work on it to show there is a nice general health scale in the MMPI. And there's a loosely structured scale called family attachment. So we have a pretty nice set of scales. So what can we do with them? Well, we can factor them, and we can include other things. The participants in our study completed the Strong Campbell Basic Interest Scales. These are homogeneous scales, so they're nice content structure. One of my favorite instruments for a long time has been the Allport-Bernie-Lindsay study of values. I picked that up from my advisor at Berkeley many years ago. It's just one of those biases you have, but I've always liked that scale. I talked to a few people earlier today about, I think values should be measured using ipsidic procedures, but they do cause problems for factor analysis, and it's not an easy thing to deal with. So we dropped one of the 5 scales because the 5th scale is fully determined when the scores on the others are computed. Other people have done that too. We've got 2 social attitudes, right-wing authoritarianism, conservatism, and well, a lot of people may not know, but early in my career I was an industrial organizational psychologist, so I knew that domain very well, and I included measures of work values, because people spend a very significant time of their day at work, doing work. Tends to get ignored by psychologists unless you're an IO psychologist. But how your attitudes toward work, etc., are an important feature of your personality. So we have 2 instruments, beliefs about work and the Protestant work ethic questionnaire. Adrian Furman has a whole book on the Protestant ethic and a chapter on beliefs about work. And there are 5 factors, and we absolutely replicated them almost perfectly. So we got a nice set of measures there. We got 2 scales out of the Protestant work ethic. So what do you get? I got to tell you, I had some trepidation when I put this together, because I remember when I did my dissertation, I had a number of tests and I factored them, and I got pure method factors. The CPI, the, what's that funny instrument I still used? The most popular, what's the most popular personality instrument in the world?
MBTI.
Huh?
MBTI.
Myers-Briggs type indicator, yeah. You got a Myers-Briggs type indicator factor, the CPI factor, and I had another test. So I thought, geez, you know, am I going to get big method factors? Absolutely not. I get 12 factors. I call them the medium 12, by the way. So this is the medium 12. Let's just quickly go through this because I want to spend some time on each one. I call the first one persuasive, law, politics, public speaking, social potency. The social potency scale was designed around Wiggins' power dimension. Just exactly what you might expect. Traditional, this is the traditional moral value. I've got 4 or 5 papers on the traditional moral values, religiousness, conservatism, authoritarianism. They correlate highly together, and the common genetic factor is the same for all three. So that these three held together nicely. We add civility and anti-leisure to them. Psychopathology, I'm going to talk in some detail about this one. Stress reaction, unworthiness, shy, well-being. Cultured, of course, this is Costa McCrae called this openness. I never like openness, I can tell you that. So I'm biased, no question about it. We'll talk about this a little more. Helpful, social and medical services, teaching, and the AVL, AVL social. The AVL social scale, by the way, if you read it, it's described as love of people. So it's not extroversion or inner, it's love of people. So it fits beautifully. We get sensation seeking. The numbers underneath, of course, are the number of different methods that are helping define the factor. Self-reliant is a little different from anything we see in most personality inventories. Analytical is a very, very interesting one. It's called investigative on the strong and other instruments. But you can see it pulls the theoretical value, science, math, medical science, and mechanical activities. Mechanical activities actually loads equally on analytical and realistic. Realistic, aggressive, as you would expect, affiliative, and entrepreneurial. So those are the 12. One of the interesting things in this table are the blank spots, but I want to use a slightly different scheme to bring out the blank spots. What I'm comparing my medium 12 to are David Campbell's orientations. David Campbell revised the strong to some extent, but he wrote his own instrument. And so there's a Campbell interest inventory. It's a little better than the strong. And he came up with these dimensions. I have the Spranger values because I included those measures and I like them. And I've got the Schwartz values because Schwartz has expanded the model in, I think, a very, very nice way. This work is really quite nice. And then I have the Tellig and MPQ scales. We have two dimensions that are defined only by personality scales. And I'm going to point out how nice that is because it's consistent with a lot of modern work on psychopathology. But we have some slots that are missing. Helpful, there's no personality scale. Analytical, realistic, and entrepreneurial. Well, let's look at each dimension, a little finer detail. I added that the other day. I did a Google search of the literature to see if I could find other factor analyses that use at least 3 of our domain. That's interest, personality, values, or work values. I found one paper. I went through hundreds of papers. So if this is the best audience in the world to ask the question, if you know of a study that made use of 3 or 4 of these domains and factored them, I'd like to know, because I can't find it. Now, Lunneborg was a kind of a psychometric counseling psychologist at the University of Washington. He published a lot of work in that domain. And Gil Atkinson, interestingly enough, was an undergraduate student at the University of Washington, came to Minnesota and helped out the Tellig develop the absorption scale. Kind of a cute, sort of interesting thing. Unfortunately, they used ipsative instruments. They had the strong vocational interest blank, which is not ipsative, but they had Edwards personal preference schedule. They had 3 instruments by Cooter, and they had one other instrument. I probably have it listed here somewhere. They had the Allport, Vernon, Lindsay. So there, if you look at their factor tables, they're really strange. but they actually match up not unreasonably with my big 12. Now, the reason I put this in is I'm not out here alone. there's something else with some similarity to what I'm talking about. Always nice to know. Okay, let's look at the scales themselves. Psychopathology. They're all MMPI scales. Unworthiness, shy, stress reaction, well-being, fearful. Is this negative emotionality? Is this neuroticism? No. The MPQ negative emotionality scale is defined by stress reaction, aggression, and alienation. Those three scales all fall on different factors. It's not MPQ negative emotionality. It's a psychopathology factor of some sort. I'm not wedded to the label, call it whatever you want. But the point here is, this is the first clear indication that we're not getting the same factor structure as you get with the MPI. I'll come back to that in a minute. When you add a lot of this other, what Cattell called hyperplane stuff, Greg Boyle reminded me of that the other day, you get a different picture of the world. Aggressive. Oh, I did add a note. The psychopathology, I think it's Bob Kruger's internalizing factor. When you think about the scales. Bob Kruger's current model to replace DSM-5 is a beautiful internalizing factor. Aggressive, it's Bob Kruger's externalizing factor. We capture them both very, very nicely. Both aggression scales, unliking virtues reversed and impulse control reversed. This is not disagreeableness. It's aggressiveness, pure and simple. I have a bias. I've been pushing it down Colin de Young's throat for about 5 years now. Agreeableness is the most crappy variable that's ever been on the face of the earth. It is stupid. Human beings are a killer species. You wouldn't know that if you read the personality journals. You have to read the New York Times every day. What do we measure? It's absolutely silly and stupid to have personality tests that don't measure one of the most fundamental variables of human existence. Why? Because of political correctness. Also, commercialism. Our instruments have been purified. We've taken out the religious items. We've taken out the nasty items. That's pure bullshit. If we want to do science, we've got to measure what's real and what's there. And the commercial instruments that are currently available are crap. I hate to say it, you've done all these studies with the big five. They're crap too. So, you can tell the sort of deep reason for this study is to disembowel the big five. And I hope I succeed, but maybe I won't. Persuasive. This is not extroversion. This factor does merge with entrepreneurial in a 9-factor solution. The distinction between persuasive leadership and entrepreneurship, however, is well established in the interest domain, and I believe this justifies keeping those two factors apart. They do merge at a higher level. The loadings of public speaking, law, and social potency. Remember, social potency was designed to get at the power dimension of Wiggins' theory. This makes it much more than extroversion. I believe with Spranger, Schwartz, McClellan, and others, that the underlying driving force behind this variable is power. Extroversion doesn't really capture that fact. Power, according to some people, is an aphrodisiac. I mean, if the variable is that powerful, and people will talk about it that way, maybe we ought to measure it. So I think we could actually measure it even better if we really focused more on that particular issue. But that's not, it's not extroversion. Traditional, I've already mentioned this. This is the traditional moral values triad. It's against the rules to measure religiousness nowadays, so you don't even have it in your instruments. But this really follows Altmaier's model very, very nicely, except for aggression. The theory of authoritarianism has been put forward as authoritarian aggression. The Berkeley group talked about it as aggression. There are very, very few tests of whether authoritarianism correlates with aggression. Well, we have aggression scales. Aggression doesn't load on that factor. We can, in fact, separate them. I think it's an important distinction. And as I've argued elsewhere, I won't go into it, I think the underlying motive here is obedience to authority, which is the term that's been widely used. Now we get to one of my favorite distinctions. Openness. Openness is a mistake. Here are the loadings for culture. I go back to Norman's, is it Norman that talked about culture? Yeah, you read his original papers, he talked about culture, the cultured people. And there's, for some of us, the term cultured carries just a tiny bit of negative connotation. But, and I think that's why it didn't get used. But there it is. There are no personality scales in the analytic column. Why is that? Why aren't there any personality scales? My colleague, again, Colin DeYoung, has actually done an analysis of the big five and come up with the 2 underlying factors in every dimension. And for openness, he discusses openness and intellect. Some people call it intellectance, etc. And he's got some interesting arguments. I think it's more than that. I think you can, in fact, pull them apart and get something quite different. So let's look at this distinction. The analytic factor was captured by Spranger, but not by Schwartz, which is kind of interesting. Everybody doesn't capture everything. The intellectual engagement scale does not load on the analytic factor, but only on the cultured factor. It primarily reflects verbal ability. Phil Ackerman has showed this very nicely. He and one of his students have a number of papers where you see that typical intellectual engagement is primarily verbal. My colleague Wendy and I have shown that people with scientific interests have much, much higher G-scores than those with cultural interests. Sizable difference. I could go into that, but it reflects some of my biases, so I'll skip it for right now. No personality scales on analytical. Why is that? I think it's a major puzzle. Now the distinction is very important. It corresponds to C.P. Snow's 2 cultures. I don't know how many people are aware of C.P. Snow's books on this topic, but there were very, very interesting discussions. And the distinction is the distinction between the humanities and the STEM disciplines. We have major distinction. Openness doesn't even come close to addressing it. The physical and psychological environments of the 2 cultures are quite distinct. There's just no question about it. The failure of quantitative psychologists to recognize and assess as a personality trait this profound intellectual distinction, the distinction between the 2 modes of thought, the narrative and the analytic, is really difficult to fathom. By the way, all the social sciences divide along these lines. There are economists who like to be verbal, and there are economists who will touch nothing but math models. There are political scientists who will narrate. There are political scientists who color. There are sociologists who want to do grounded theory and just talk to people. There are sociologists who will only measure. Every social science discipline divides on this variable. Why don't we measure it? It's silly not to. There's a discriminant function that discriminates between people in the humanities and the STEM disciplines. Look at the theoretical versus aesthetic distinction. Very, very powerful. You can divide them almost perfectly with just a few measures. So how real is the distinction? I think it's very, very real, and other people think so too. Dean Symington has discussed this problem at some length and argued that genuine instances of scientific creativity at the behavioral level display the telltale characteristics of constrained stochastic processes. In other words, they don't engage in extreme absorption and fantasy like Frank Barron used to talk about. Scientific types think differently from humanistic types. Doesn't mean there can't be people in between who do both, but you really do get considerable separation. It's an important distinction. A recent paper really makes this point with a vengeance. Campbell and Wang used the Webb method, and they enlisted every undergraduate student in the graduating 2014 Princeton University class. And they asked them about mental illness in their siblings and their families. And the questionnaires were pretty nice. I read the paper and got some of the material. I think they did a good job. It has to be replicated. I really would like, we got a lot of people in universities here. I'd love to see somebody replicate this at another university. But what they found was students aspiring to technical majors, science, mathematics, and engineering, the STEM disciplines, were more likely than other students to report a sibling with an autistic spectrum disorder. Students interested in the humanities were more likely to report a family member with major depressive disorder, bipolar disorder, or substance abuse problems. Now, a lot of us thought this was true for a long time, but this is some of the best evidence I've ever seen. I consulted with James Lee, who actually took my job at Minnesota, who is really a very, very smart guy. He knows a lot of physicists and mathematicians. And he said, I've asked around, and I've been told that among the very, very best physicists and mathematicians, 25% of them are easily autistic. Why don't we have numbers on that? Why isn't that nailed down? Are we afraid to look at ourselves in some ways? It's very, very odd. In any event, they developed an equation that just divides the two beautifully. There's clearly something here that's been completely missed. Scientific creativity differs from creativity in the arts, requiring a strong element of logical deduction. Our report differing psychopathological patterns in the two cultures suggests that any linkage between psychopathology and creativity is likely to differ depending on whether one is interested primarily in arts or sciences. All previous work has just mixed this stuff all up. This is a fundamental distinction we don't measure. Shame on us. Helpful. Helpful is defined only by interest scales. Actually, the MMPI, MPQ, CPI pool simply missed empathy, altruism, etc. Big mistake. The items are not there. That's the reason. This is a real dimension, and it should have turned up, but it didn't. Interestingly, it's one of de Young's facets of agreeableness. The other, by the way, is politeness, and that gets captured on the traditionalism scale. So the agreeableness scale is really a mixture of two dimensions that should be separated. So I've done away with neuroticism, I've done away with agreeableness, I've done away with openness. None of the big five are going to survive. Well, and they're the dominant model. What the hell is going on? I'm probably wrong. Sensation seeking, obvious. Marv Zuckerman has been shoving this down our throat for years, and he's absolutely right. This is a powerful dimension and deserves to be measured. I'm not sure we've got the full handle on it. We don't have any questions about drug abuse and things of the sort that Zuckerman has in his scale. But it's clearly there. Our 9-factor solution, sensation seeking and aggression, merge and they form a negative constraint factor. The two contents, though, are different. It's physical aggression, it's the physical environment for sensation seeking mostly, and it's people for aggression. And I think that's an important distinction in terms of contents of the environment which people respond to. So I think we should maintain the distinction. But we could go to the big 9 if the data pushes us that way. Self-restraint is kind of unique, but my colleagues in industrial organizational psychology have been measuring this in a kind of number of complex ways for years. They call it rugged individualism, and that's really what it is. But notice, it absorbs achievement. Achievement doesn't come out as one of the medium 12. And if you think about these traits, I imagine some bitter guy living in the back forest of Idaho, off the grid. I mean, if you're high on that trait, that's sort of the image I get. Realistic. There's a little bit more on. It turns out when achievement loaded on that, I went and looked at the items. And the items on achievement are all self, not working with other people. They're all self-driven. So they fit in very, very nicely with the self-reliance scale from the work values questionnaire. I go back and look at the items in my instruments just to get a sense of what's going on. Realistic is really an interesting dimension. No personality measures of it, only vocational interests. And people have had a hard time with it. Holland called it a reflection of the motoric orientation. Ann Rowe called it outdoors. David Campbell called it producing. It's actually at the things end of the things versus people distinction that you see in vocational interest psychology. But that construct is not bipolar. There's some beautiful work by Rounds and his students. So that's not a bipolar dimension. So probably not the right way to characterize it. But you get a huge sex difference on this. Maybe that's why we don't have a personality variable. Maybe we don't want to have any sex differences. If you look at the Holland themes, realistic and people give you huge, huge differences. In engineering, massive, massive difference. And science and math too, but not as big. This is an important distinction. Why isn't there a personality scale to capture it? Sherry Berenbaum was a postdoc in my lab many, many years back, and so I've always been in touch with her over the years. And she points out, when we look at hormonal effects on behavior, we don't get too much in personality, but we get effects in vocational interests. And we get sex differences. And they don't look like they come from socialization, they look like they come from hormonal, biological effects. So we've missed the boat in terms of getting a personality measure of this particular trait. So is realistic a personality trait? I would think it would be. Certainly EPD theory points you clearly in that direction. So does a lot of other data. But there's a clear bias, another bias, in the instruments we use. The strong Campbell interest inventory is very, very weak on baker, candlestick maker, etc., lower class occupations. crafts, occupations, etc., that ought to be measured by a good vocational. It turns out it was designed to help people pick their college majors. That's not a kind of instrument you want to use if you're doing science and you're doing entire populations. You use an instrument that covers everything. But we don't have such an instrument, where there's a kind of narrowness and I don't know, a business mentality to sell tests and stuff rather than to do scientific work. Every once in a while I just get really ticked off, as you can tell. Affiliation. Of course, this is a fundamental, it doesn't appear in a 9-factor solution, it appears in a 12-factor solution. It's such a fundamental variable that you can't go with a 9-factor, you can't get rid of this variable. It has a long history in psychology. There's a long history of the evolution of this variable. It's the core of Sarich's argument about evolution. So this is a nice example of standard rules for selecting the number of factors are baloney. You got to use the rules, and then you got to use your head. And so a standard analysis telling me there's 9 factors. I look at it, I get 12. Let me tell you, I think there's 12. Okay, Baumeister and O'Leary have got a beautiful paper on this. Anybody wants to look at belongingness and affiliation, this is, I think, this is a key paper. Okay, where's conscientiousness? Told you I was going to take apart every single one of the big 5. This doesn't even appear. If we factor the Minnesota personality inventory, the 21 scales, we do get something that looks like conscientiousness. No, we didn't have conservatism, right-wing authoritarianism, and anti-leisure, but we had aggression, achievement, and, you know, civility, unlikely virtues, control, religiousness looks like conscientiousness. But when you fill in the hyperspace, a la Patel, you get the traditionalism factor and you get the aggressive factor. Now, this distinction has been known for a long time. Jane Levenger has argued in numerous papers over the years that psychometricians have a conformity factor, not a conscientious. Ego development is conscientiousness in her particular model. And she's absolutely right. And we get basically a conformity factor. I prefer obedience to conformity, but when it's quibbling about the distinction. And again, aggressiveness is a much more fundamental variable, and it's not agreeableness. Is there a general factor? No. I agree with Bill Revell. Revell and Will, I think, have cut the head off this monster. There is no general factor of personality. The omega hierarchical is about 0.44, a little higher than some other personality inventories, but right where you might expect it, compared to about 7.4 in the cognitive domain. If you look at the general factor loadings, they're all over the place, and many of them are absolutely trivial. I publish a lot in intelligence. I know what a general factor looks like, and it doesn't look like this kind of thing. So there's no general factor. In fact, a parallel analysis, scree test, and 4 eigenvalues above 1 all say, if you want to factor this data, which I ordinarily wouldn't do because I don't particularly care for factors much higher than this in the personality domain, you get 4 factors. Okay, I call these the final 4 instead of the big 5. And my down-to-earth factor, I'm not sure that's the right name. I'm open for new names, etc. But realistic, helpful, analytical. I mean, this is a very, very nice factor structure. Not much doubt about it at all. The psychopathology stuff goes together. And Kruger calls it general psychopathology. I call it dangerousness. people high on this trait are friggin' dangerous. And of course, human beings are friggin' dangerous. Under the right circumstances, they can do all kinds of things. Read a little bit of history. There's clearly an authoritarian factor, traditionalism, self-restraint, and just what you'd expect from a lot of predictions, kind of an anti-cultural facet to authoritarianism, and then a power dimension. Those are the factors. I prefer to work at a lower level. I think it's far, far more meaningful. So, a down-to-earth person would call himself realistic, helpful, thoughtful, unpretentious, practical, and sensible. You can go out, somebody could go out and check that. That's a prediction about adjectives. Wait a minute, did I go back? Yeah. As I pointed out, personal psychopathology is what Kruger calls this, and his personal psychopathology is defined by 4 facets: antagonism, negative affect, detachment, and disinhibition. Exactly what the measure we have here. Authoritarianism, again, I've emphasized the lack of aggression, been overdone. Somebody's got to do a replication, because this is, I think, quite interesting and powerful. Okay. Here's what I think the nature of the final 4 is. I think they represent worldviews, how people see the world and therefore how they respond to it, why they do things. Experience-producing drive theory is designed to explain why people do things. And of course, it tries to explain the evolution of those particular traits as well. Down-to-earth people are practical. They work with their hands, they create things, they make things. Dangerous people put you in danger. They see the world as threatening and dangerous, and they respond in kind. Authoritarian people are submissive. They obey authority. They do what they're told. By the way, our society wouldn't work unless most people did what they were told. Authoritarianism is degraded, downgraded by academics because, of course, they don't like to see themselves that way. But if you think about it hard, obedience and following the rules and being polite is what makes most societies work. If you want to sample a society where you don't get a lot of that, you might read Napoleon Chauvin's recent book, Noble Savages, where authority is difficult to impose. It's not the kind of life you might want to live. I think psychologists are not treating this quite properly. And powerful people, of course, like to be in charge. They do things. They build things. They build corporations, companies, universities, departments, etc. So these are very, very broad experience-producing drives. The bottom line, the inclusion of measures of interest, values, work motivations, social attitudes, and a factor analysis yields a quite different picture of human personality than the use of only personality scales. From the point of view of EPD revised theory, the standard approach to personality assessment is highly impoverished. Thank you very much.